This is the business emergency room. And just like in any ER, every second counts. You need a clear diagnosis and the right treatment plan. But in business, too often leaders treat symptoms instead of the underlying disease. Maybe it's strategic swelling, or pivotitis, or obsessive sales disorder. These are the product plagues that quietly weaken your organization and erode value every day. Today's guest, Radhika Dutt, offers a radical prescription. Stop chasing those arbitrary goals and start solving puzzles instead. Together, we'll explore how putting ears on the track can turn measurement into real growth. Leadership today isn't just about scaling. It's about navigating constant uncertainty, market disruptions, and high-pressure decisions. If you're dealing with chaos, bottlenecks, and relentless pressure, welcome to the Business Emergency Room. Hey, thanks for tuning in. I am very excited about today's subject and today's guest because it takes me back to my roots and my background, my professional background. I am here today with Radhika Dutt. She is the author of Radical Product Thinking. She's also a speaker and a consultant, and has for 25 years worked across industries for anything from telecom, robotics, and consumer apps, etc. Takes from what she's learned in all those industries about what works and actually drives results, and that is what she's using in her business today. She's also been part of 5 acquisitions herself, so has some scars to speak from. And like me, she has a background in engineering, then focused very much in this product development stage or part of business. To me, that's very exciting. Different perspective. I'm very excited you're here. Welcome, Radhika.
Thank you, Maartje. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so we are going to talk about growth, improvement, actually scaling effectively and getting to better and more effective, etc. In that space, you talk about product diseases, which in the context of a business emergency room is, of course, to me, a fabulous term. Can you talk more about what you mean, or what are examples of these product diseases?
Yeah. So I have found that this term product diseases makes it so much easier for us to talk about these issues, right? Because diseases are things that we don't blame people for necessarily. It just is so ubiquitous. We just catch them accidentally. And so it's important to be able to talk about it really openly so that once we diagnose these diseases, finally, we can start to cure them. And so let's talk about product diseases, and I'll give you a few examples. And I've caught so many of them myself. So one example, this one is probably my favorite, is obsessive sales disorder. Right? It happens when salespeople have this glimmer in their eye and they say to you, we could win this mega deal if we just add this one custom feature. And it sounds mostly harmless. So we say, yes, let's do it. And then pretty soon, your entire roadmap is driven by everything that you have to make good on, right? So that's obsessive sales disorder. Another example is pivotitis, where you're jumping from one shiny thing to the next. Sometimes it's almost like every sprint becomes this new pivot, almost based on which customer is screaming the loudest. So that's pivotitis. Another example is strategic swelling, where your product starts out well, and then, one customer says to you, if you add this one feature, I could also use your product to do blah. And you add that feature. And next, another customer has another idea. Oh, you could also do this. And pretty soon you start adding features and you do more and more and more. And your product could make coffee for you if you just ask nicely. That's strategic swelling, where it gets so bloated, you no longer recognize it, right? And I'll mention just one more product disease, but there are other product diseases you can look at in Radical Product Thinking, the first book I wrote. But I'll mention one more, which is a disease that is just so common recently. It's what I call hypermetricemia, where we're just so obsessed with metrics that it's all about moving metrics up and to the right, but we don't consider, are these even the right metrics to be measuring? So those are a few examples of product diseases. And just to conclude on why do they happen, it's when there is a break in the chain from translating vision into everyday actions. Whenever there's a break in the chain from translating vision into action, that's where product diseases creep in, when our iterations are no longer driven by a clear vision.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking, right? The immune system here is failing, because I always say the vocabulary I use is that if you have a strong vision and you know where you're going, that should function as a filter, right? And in this case, that should function as your immune system to say, hey, are we crazy going this far? And in your enthusiasm, I think we all have a little of this, right? Particularly early on in the business or stuff. Even healthy and well-functioning businesses have these intricacies that they just do for this one client, right? In your first example, the sales disorder, I think some of those stick. And if they're in a little extra, what they call in New Orleans, lagniappe, a little extra service, maybe that's not the worst. But if it starts to mess with the core of who you are and actually becomes devaluating for your products and services in your attempt to actually grow, that of course doesn't sound great. Can you talk a little bit more about what are some of the symptoms that if people are looking at their business today, they might recognize some of these. What to you are clear symptoms for a leader that they see in their business that they might be suffering from some of these diseases? If they're not intricately involved in that part of the process, what are some of the secondary symptoms that you see in your organization that might indicate you have a problem here?
Oh, such an interesting question. And I think the way I want to answer it is by going back to something you said, which is you said a vision needs to be a filter, right? That's one of the primary failings that I see in organizations where the vision is so broad, by the way, that it no longer is acting like a filter. And again, I don't blame leaders for this because the thing is we've learned that a good vision is something that's broad, it never changes, etc. Right? So we've learned that a good vision is aspirational and never changing. Well, in that case, how can it be a filter? So let's talk through a real example. Boeing's vision, for example, is to be the global enduring industrial champion in aerospace, right? Honestly, what does that even mean? Do you measure best in aerospace by revenues, market share? Is it innovation? I mean, how do you measure it? And so without that clarity, that's where it's no longer acting like a filter. So share buybacks, yeah, let's do it. Should we build 737 Max just so that we can keep our market share? Yeah, let's do it. Forget building the new narrow body plane from scratch, which is what they were supposed to do, right? And then you have this misstep after misstep, and which is why you have all of these issues that they've had over time, including the 2 crashes because of the 737 Max, right? Plus, on top of that, they've had quality issues like panels flying off of planes. Why do those things happen? It's because you have a vision that just is meaningless. So and by the way, what happens then when you have a meaningless vision? You're often using goals and OKRs as duct tape on foundational cracks. So we don't have a clear vision that says what we need to do. So we use OKRs or goals or KPIs to say, this is what we want to achieve. And so what happens? Everyone achieves those numbers or says, listen, we've achieved those numbers, but they haven't necessarily thought about the long term and how you're doing that. In the Boeing case, yes, we achieved production targets, but there were these panels flying off of planes and quality issues, right? So these are the kinds of things that we need to look at as leaders. So one thing you can use as a diagnostic measure is how clear is our vision? If I ask someone, what's our vision? Are they just repeating back? Are they parroting back words that they've memorized? Or are they able to describe a problem statement, the end state we envision? Are they able to articulate why is this problem even important to solve? Right? Just talk to a few people in the company and see how real is your vision.
And so am I assuming then you want to also go a level deeper and go have a look at your product or services portfolio and say, hey, what is it that we're all doing and delivering? And how well does that still contribute and fit with our value, or what in there is actually no longer us, or maybe was us? Is that the level you're going back down to as well?
Absolutely. I think every product in your portfolio should have its vision as well. Every product manager should be able to describe that vision, and they should have a product strategy. And in the Radical Product Thinking book, I describe what that means. But you're exactly right.
Okay, so it's not just looking at the vision at high level, but it should translate down to the contribution of the various activities and services and products in your portfolio to that vision, so that changes and updates to any of it can actually be brought in. You've mentioned a few times now traditional ways of setting goals, right? And traditional metrics that are being used. I know that you have a different view on how to actually drive yourself to reach those next level iterations and the improvements and the upgrades, the upscaling that you're after, whatever the terminology is you want to hang it on. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, one thing I've found is that goals and targets don't really work well. Why is that? Because when you're a leader and you set a target for a team, what you're really incentivizing them to do is to show you, ta-da, those numbers, we've achieved them. Whatever that initiative was, their incentive is to show you, yes, that initiative is working, here are the numbers to prove it. What you really want them to do is give you the truth, to look at the good and the bad, and to not just show you the good numbers and say, yes, we've done what you said, but rather to also look at the bad numbers and to say, okay, what's not working, right? You want them to look at the bad numbers, do a little digging, play detective, solve the puzzle of what is that telling us? Is there a problem? Is there an opportunity? So this is why goals and OKRs or targets don't work, because it creates the wrong mindset. What you need is a mindset of puzzle setting and puzzle solving.
Yeah. So this, I think we all as leaders have experience with this. We've asked for something and we put a stake in the ground saying, I want this or I want that, or maybe done the thing we also all do, which is put a rather arbitrary number out there because we had to do something, right? And if you told the team, I want 10% growth, but then retention falls by the wayside and nobody tells you that, and they showed they'd achieved the 10% growth, but at the expense of retention. And so the net growth is not what you want people to tell you. Would you rather have 8% sustainable growth because that's what we can manage with the capacity and where we're at? Or do you really want 10% growth, but then it's at the expense of something else? You want to create that feedback loop. And what you're saying is, too often, even if it's not willful, right? Even if you give people very rigid numbers, they might just end up really managing towards the numbers and stop thinking about the underlying reason why the numbers are what they are.
Yeah, I so agree with everything you've said. But a lot of OKR or KPI experts, what they will tell you is, well, that just means you're setting the wrong goals. They might say, oh, what you just said about this example of retention versus growth, well, that just means you also set retention numbers and you set this other number for growth, etc. But here's the reality, that you cannot possibly set every possible number. And even if you think you have set every possible number, the reality is you figure out that maybe that's not the right thing to work on. I'll give you an example. You might be
I don't know what the interdependencies are between them, maybe too, right?
Exactly. You might be working on a conversion funnel, right? And you might say, we want to get to 20,000 signups by the end of this quarter. Okay, well, maybe the signups is not the problem. Maybe the problem is further up in the funnel. Or maybe it's not even for the number of signups don't matter at all. What you need to be thinking of is, are you converting the people you already have? Or maybe the bounce rate is too high. These are the kinds of things that you have to give your team the ability to not just follow rigid numbers and targets, but rather to go figure out the puzzle of what is happening and what do I do? Right. And so hence this mindset shift of puzzle setting and puzzle solving instead of chasing numbers.
Okay, so if we take an example of a business that has one service, or like a financial institution that needs growth, right? Growth in its member base, because of where the size of the business is a little tricky, and it needs to make it to a next level. So let's say that that's the challenge at hand. How do I then make that in a puzzle that doesn't stay at this level, but that actually, like KPIs, for instance, are intended to make it real for everybody on the ground, what their piece in the puzzle is to solve?
Yeah. So here's an example, right? So let's take this financial institution and we say they're trying to figure out this growth. So maybe the puzzle that you set as a CEO, you might say, we grew in the last year, but growth is sort of slowed. That's what we're observing. And we want to continue this growth trajectory. But there seems to be a problem. So here are some guiding questions. So that was the problem statement. Now here are some guiding questions. What might be happening? Is it that there's a competitor that has come along that is doing something and has figured something out and we are falling behind? Is it that perhaps, our product was really good for this early adopter and they have a very specific need, but we haven't figured out what the mass market actually needs. So maybe our product doesn't work for the mass market. Or maybe it's our messaging. Is it that our messaging reaches that early adopter, but we haven't figured out what is the messaging for that mass market, right? So those are some questions I genuinely don't know answers to. Those might form the puzzles that either your whole team figures out together, or, maybe the sales team takes one piece of the puzzle, figuring out, how do I sell to this different part of the market? Maybe the product team takes away one piece. Maybe the marketing team takes away another piece. But we're going to solve this puzzle by figuring out these different pieces and coming back. And so next we can talk about puzzle solving and what that means.
Yeah. So my loyal listeners will know that I use the example of the puzzle board a lot, right? Because if you're in whatever state you are, if you are in a state where things are not working, I always say, well, at least let's bring everything together to the puzzle board that we do have. And even if we don't know how many pieces are in the puzzle, how big it is, if we start putting together the pieces we do have, we also see where we have these ginormous blind spots, right? In your example, I hear, lots of good questions, but they're based on hypothesis, right? On ideas where it might be. How does this concept also work for finding out the stuff you maybe don't know, right? Because if you've been working in your organization, you get so siloed and blinded at times. So how is this also a useful setup to actually figure out the stuff that you didn't know?
Yeah. So this methodology, by the way, for puzzle setting and puzzle solving is what I call OHLs, objectives, hypotheses, and learnings. And this question of when do you set the hypothesis, I think is a really important one. So in this particular case, I was just giving an example based on, something I'd worked on actually recently. And this ended up being sort of what our puzzle was about. But one advice that I would have for people is don't set the hypothesis too early, because one thing I notice often is we set the hypothesis, and then all of the listening that we do, it's with the lens of that hypothesis. And so we think, therefore, this is the problem, and we're more focused on the solution. So everything that we're hearing from potential customers, from our customers, we tend to put it on a puzzle board with a certain set of assumptions in place. And so the suggestion that I have is, and this is how we operate and design sprints, don't set the hypothesis too early. Go into customer interview meetings where you're genuinely listening to their problems, observing what is it that they do? How are they achieving that today? Don't go in with a picture of this is the solution that we want you to be using. How would you use the solution? That is the wrong question to want to get an answer to. Like, just get a baseline for how do they work? How do they think? What are their mental models? And then you can start to build a hypothesis and then test solutions.
Yeah, and I love that, because in product development, that's very much in the early stages of the process, but it's so relevant in so many situations in life, right? The problem with the human brain is all the self-imposed filters, and so what information do you get? And that's why I love the analog of diseases and the business emergency room and you with your diseases too, right? Because it's about trying to figure out all these different, well, first some symptoms, but then kind of find out what else was there in the picture that might have been a piece of the puzzle. And if you ask the wrong or closed off questions, you're never going to find out about what else has also maybe happened, right? Looking a bit forward, how if you transition to this kind of a methodology, is that a very complex and fundamental change of how you would work with your teams and inside your teams? How do people implement this? How complex is this?
Yeah, what is fascinating to me, right, is it's a mindset change as opposed to complexity in terms of processes. In fact, this doesn't add process burden, but it's a different way of thinking. So I'll give you one big piece of this, which is the puzzle solving part. And once I describe it, you'll see how intuitive it feels, right? So I talked about puzzle setting and how you've set the puzzle. Now, in terms of puzzle solving, the way you would approach it is by asking 3 questions. So the first question is, how well did it work? And when you ask how well did it work, it means you want to hear both the good and the bad. The second question is, what did you learn? And this is where I tell teams, don't just, give me a list of stats and data and numbers and metrics. Tell me the story. You look at all of this data and tell me, what have you learned? What have you figured out? And then comes the third question, which is based on how well it worked and based on what you learned, what would you try next? Right? And so when you think about these 3 questions, how well did it work? What have we learned? What will I try next? It seems so intuitive, right? So when I think about what is the change and how do you bring this about in an organization? When you're a leader, you can introduce this approach to your team, right? You can, in fact, start by role modeling it. Take an initiative that you've worked on and present it to the team in this format of how well did it work? What have we learned? What will we try next, right? And you start to produce this mindset where it's okay to share the good and the bad, talk about learnings, what you'll try. Once you've role modeled this, now you get your team to try this approach. Get them, when you do one-on-ones with them, in the safety of that one-on-one space, they can present to you information about whatever they're working on in exactly that format. And you can give them course corrections and feedback. Maybe, I'm not seeing the depth of the analysis in terms of what have I learned. Like, you haven't analyzed the numbers deep enough. Have you considered this? Have you considered that? In terms of what you're going to do next, this is too big a risk. Instead of 6 months of development work to do this, can you try a smaller risk? These are the things you can do as a leader.
Yeah, I'm bought in. What I'm hearing is also that this approach aids empowerment, I totally see increased transparency, which I think at the speed which most of us need to operate in business these days is paramount, and speed. Yeah, I see how a process like this takes the sequentialness out of the process, right? Because people are gonna, if you give them targets, typically, well, if they're longer term targets, you might get some update moments, but even the update moments are typically very rigid. And you find too often that people don't feel the need to come back in between, even if they find weird or intriguing things, because they take the goals and the targets as the gospel. And so having a more fluid setup and creating empowerment for people to speak up and come back and say, yeah, we need a different level of steer in order to move the needle here. Yeah.
I love what you said. And to add to that, right, a lot of people, a lot of OKR experts will say, well, you just have to set quarterly KPIs or quarterly OKRs so that you can do this monitoring. But no matter whether it's quarterly or yearly, you run into the same problem, which is when you have targets and OKRs, KPIs, etc., you always have the view in the rear view mirror.
Reactive.
You know, it's always a view in the rear view mirror that you've either hit the target or not, but you don't know, well, what do I do about it? And there's this British saying, you know, you can measure the pig as many times as you want. You can weigh the pig as many times as you want. It's not going to fatten it anymore. So just by measuring, you don't change the outcomes necessarily, right? And so this approach of puzzle setting and puzzle solving, it's like having ears on the track. That's how one CEO described it to me. It's like having ears on the track because it makes measurement actionable. You can hear what's coming and therefore take action.
Okay, well, so if those listening would like to reach out to you and get some help putting their ears on the track or finding more about your book or about your speaking or about your offering, where do they go? What do they do?
Oh, great. So reach out to me on LinkedIn. I always love to hear how people are applying this approach. You can also download the free OHL's toolkit, and we can include that in the show notes. It's on radicalproduct.com, and you can look up toolkits, and there's the OHL's toolkits right there. And lastly, I'm currently working on this next book about why goals, targets, and OKRs don't work and what actually works instead, where I talk about how you can transition from goal setting to puzzle setting and puzzle solving. And so if you use this OHL's approach, you're welcome to reach out to me and share with me your experiences, and your case study might just make it into the book.
That's a nice challenge. Well, I love the 3 questions. I hope you took away from the fun terminology of the product diseases. Learning about a different idea to make progress an active rather than a reactive tracking or movement. How well did it work? What did you learn? And what would you do next? Good questions for us leaders to ask anybody we work with to actually hear a unfiltered version of those who've done the work, right? So great advice. I loved having you here. Thank you for joining us today, Radhika.
Thank you so much for having me. I loved our conversation.
Yes, and thank you, listener, for tuning in today. I hope to have you back on the next episode. Bye for now. Thank you. That's it for this episode of the Business Emergency Room. If you are currently dealing with chaos or disruption in your business, please reach out. You can email, text, or call, and I will find a way to connect with you within 24 hours. I've helped others steer out of the storm, and I know I can help you too. Talk soon. Please like, subscribe, and share.